Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess. It's about that time of day when we have to adjust our um, good mornings to good afternoons. So I'm Adam Myers of the Health and the Public Interest Program, which I co-direct with Adrian Fu Berman, who is also on the seminar and waved to you a second ago. Um, the Health and the Public Interest Program is a program that emphasizes social determinants of health and non-medical factors that influence health in the healthcare system. We um, we invite students and seminar speakers who are um, people who are interested in challenging the current system, advocating for meaningful and positive change in the system, and we'll have the website for the program in the chat. And while I'm talking about chat, let me mention that today's seminar speaker, who's Ed Silverman, is going to be speaking without slides, and he's going to have our moderator looking at the chat and monitoring if anyone has their hand raised so that we can have some interaction if that's working out well. So without any further ado, let me ask Michaela to now start her introduction.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining today. As Dr. Myers mentioned, my name is Michaela, and I have the pleasure of moderating the seminar today for Mr. Ed Silverman, who is a senior writer and Pharmalot columnist at Stat and has covered the pharmaceutical industry for more than 25 years. Prior to joining STAT at its founding in 2015, he worked at the Wall Street Journal, the Star Ledger of New Jersey, and New York Newsday, among other publications. He won the Gerald Loeb Award for Business Journalism Commentary in 2018 for his Pharmalot View columns, along with several former Wall Street Journal colleagues. Ed was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in explanatory journalism in 2016 for a series of stories on prescription drug pricing. He earned an accounting degree from Binghamton University and a master's in journalism from New York University. And please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Ed Silverman.
Thanks, Michaela. Thanks, Adam. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And I just want to issue a caveat. I've got two dogs here. I'm working out of what I call the Pharmalot campus, and my two dogs might pop in and out of your view now and then or just make noise. So please forgive me and bear with me. Um, anyway, so um, I was asked to talk about um, the influence of the of industry um, the, on physicians and how the overall attempt to boost sales by industry, and this includes device makers, can affect medical practice and medical research. So I'll just give you a little context into my thinking and coverage, and then walk through some of the issues and events that I've encountered over the past 30 years. In fact, it's more than 25 now. I've been covering the pharmaceutical industry since 1995. Long time. So, but I mention that because when I first started that work, I joined the Star Ledger of New Jersey at the time. The pharmaceutical industry was, to use an old cliche, fat and happy. There was a lot of money to be made. A lot of companies were um, coming out with what were called Me Too drugs. The fourth cholesterol pill, the fifth antidepressant, the sixth pill for high blood pressure. Um, I'm based in New Jersey, where a lot of the largest companies either had global or US headquarters. If somebody wanted to change a job, it wasn't a problem. There was a lot of employment to be had. Get in a car, drive down the turnpike, the Jersey Turnpike, the Garden State Parkway, or one way or the other. You could do very well for yourself. And that reflected the fact that the companies were, yes, making a lot of money. There's more emphasis on that kind of work than what we think of as innovation. That never stopped. It was always there. But the outward face certainly projected or gave the impression that most of the companies were content to boost the bottom line with these products that replicated their competition. And the reason I mention this is significant because, when you have four or five or six of the same kind of product, you need to do something to differentiate yourself. And if all the products work similarly, in fact, they have the same mechanism of action, the same kind of ingredients, the same dosaging, why should we take one product instead of another? And of course, in this country, you can't easily um, convince the public to take a particular product without being able to get into their psyche. I happened to start covering the industry just before advertising regulations were loosened. So now we do have a lot more direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription medicines, of course. It wasn't quite the same in 95, but even when it started, and it's still, even when it started, it created some friction, tension with physicians, and that continues to this day because doctors, right or wrong, were gatekeepers. But, there's probably good and bad with that. It's not black and white. But the issue was for the pharmaceutical companies, how do we convince the physicians to prescribe our pill, our drug, whatever, our treatment to the patient? And that became a big marketing game. And the marketing game was extremely powerful. These are large companies with multi-billion dollars in sales each year, large portfolios of products, a lot of laboratory investment. But what's driving the innovation, for example, cancer medicines came out in a big way, like checkpoint inhibitors, other sorts of cancer treatments the last several years, decade or more. That originated in whichever laboratories, whether it was a big company or a small company bought by a big company years earlier. But meanwhile, fueling a lot of that work was the sales for so many of the companies of these Me Too drugs. And again, I'm generalizing, it's not across the board, but it's pretty easy to look this up on Google and verify what I'm saying, again, in broad terms. So that marketing required the companies to use a certain amount of imagination and convince physicians, whether they're in practice seeing patients or they're doing research somewhere at an academic medical center, university, to sign on to the use of their medicine. And so this created an opportunity for the pharmaceutical industry, but also a challenge and also a big risk because we also want balance between risk and benefit when we develop, approve, and prescribe and use a medicine. So how do you make distinctions between your product? If you're going to stay true to the risk and benefit equation and not distort that, and how do you convince a physician to go with your pill? And so this set in motion a playbook of sorts for the industry over a long time, a number of years, where a lot of companies realized, it didn't take much, that the best way to get physicians' attention was to make it worth their while. And I realize that sounds like I'm disparaging physicians, but it's also true. If you don't know this, and some of you who do, forgive me for repeating what might seem like the obvious sort of ancient history, but there are a lot of efforts to woo physicians to get them to prescribe brand A, brand B, whatever. And this involved different sorts of practices. You could bestow research grants. You could invite a doctor to become what some call a key opinion leader or just a regular speaker at dinners or conferences. And you could decide, well, gee, you're a high prescriber, or the sales rep has a good rapport with a particular doctor. Let's make sure that they get tickets to a sporting event, a theater event. Often There were uh, trips paid for to what appeared to be medical conferences or conferences that were devised for the sake of gathering enough physicians in one spot and essentially making a strong sales pitch to prescribe a particular medicine in the context of learning how to treat a disease. These were all studiously employed by rather large, sophisticated marketing operations in many of the companies over a period of time. And um, this was used by internal marketing people, medical sales liaisons who would answer questions on the phone. Obviously, maybe not obviously, but particularly sales reps, those who would go to the doctors around the country. And um, this led to a lot of concern because it suggested that there was a distortion, if you will, in the marketplace. Were these medicines being prescribed for all the right reasons? And this became a, an issue going back more than 20 years, really. I can recall, and I may not recall everything in the proper sequential order, but I remember an organization called the American Medical Student Association had decided to create what they called a farm-free environment, which meant when sales reps would come to talk to the classes, uh, avoid taking the pens, avoid taking the tchotchkes that had the logos of the company or a particular medicine. So that became a very obvious form of pushback that um, started to send a message and started to raise awareness. Before I continue, by the way, um, as you were invited, if you'd like to use the chat function to type in a question or a comment, want to ask me something, challenge me about something, feel free. I'll get to it because I'd like to make this a conversation for the time we have. I don't have to do all the talking. Um, so anyway, that created that pushback created an awareness that began bubbling up. I think there was a lot of concern already, though, among advocacy groups, consumer groups, watchdogs, all of the above, because it was sort of obvious that the competition was creating more of a marketing environment or an environment that was beholden more to marketing than science. And gradually, what occurred was different levels of government began to get interested in this. Um, this started to occur really through whistleblower lawsuits very often. I mentioned the sales reps. A lot of the sales reps who actually were required to bring pizzas, drop off basketball tickets, get doctors lined up for dinners, to speak at dinners where they would get extra honoraria, sign them up to go on junkets, for lack of a better term. Some of them decided they'd had enough, and they also realized when they talked to attorneys that represent whistleblowers that there could be a big payback. A certain amount of uh, they could claim if a whistleblower lawsuit that is picked up by the government, by which I mean the Justice Department decides to join or intervene in a whistleblower case already filed in court and successfully prosecutes that lawsuit, and a company is determined that, or a company reaches a settlement, the whistleblower gets a large portion of the payout, the settlement money. So there was an incentive. This is part of the whole whistleblower structure. There was an incentive for sales reps to file these cases. And because this playbook was used very broadly across the industry, a growing number of sales reps filed these whistleblower lawsuits. And the Justice Department started to take note because an attorney wants the Justice Department to join or intervene in a case because that increases the odds that a company will feel pressure to eventually settle, reduces the attorney's expenses, increases the odds of a payout for the whistleblower sales rep and their attorneys. So this pattern started to emerge in the early, somewhere I'd say somewhere between 2000 and 2006, 7, 8, there were more and more of these whistleblower lawsuits that came up. And as a result, um, the uh, matter prompted a couple of U.S. senators. It was Chuck Grassley, and forgive me, I have it somewhere just to Herb Kohl. Grassley was a Republican. Grassley's still around. He still represents Iowa. Herb Kohl was a Democrat from Wisconsin. I think he was the chair of the Special Senate Committee on Aging. And they decided to draft a law called the Sunshine Act, Sunshine Physician Payments Act, that would require drug companies and device companies to disclose, report their payments each year to physicians. Different kinds of payments, like sort I mentioned, meals, entertainment, travel, lodging, research, that sort of thing. And that gained traction. It did become law. It was folded into what became the Affordable Care Act. And a few years later, I think it was by late 2013 or early 2014, the Open Payments Database was launched. And that exists to this day. It's a resource for people who want to know about the payments to physicians by drug and device companies. It's a very good resource. It's been tinkered with and upgraded over time. And I'm still one of those people who looks to that on a regular basis. But getting back to um, the, the genesis of all this, um, the this created a foundation, if you will, for distortion in the prescription drug business because many companies were using this playbook to promote their medicines. And excuse me, I'm just going to get some water. This also came about with the opioid um, crisis because it wasn't just, okay, let's try to convince a doctor by making some kind of a payment that they'll prescribe our drug. We know, of course, that prescription opioids rather, were often not just promoted by this sort of marketing maneuver, but what came with it was downplaying the addictive risks and overstating the benefits. So, um, so this pattern, this unfortunate pattern of business activity, set in motion a very long period of time in which um, marketing distorted the usefulness of the drugs and how they should be viewed, not just in the marketplace, but by physicians and consumers across the country. So, no questions yet, so I'll keep talking. There was another aspect to this, by the way. It wasn't just marketing that came with it, but wait, I do see 7 new messages. All right, before I continue that thought, let me see what they say.
Mickey can monitor the chat, so don't worry about reading it.
Okay. Okay. So anyway, there was also an issue that came up during this time, particularly in conjunction, I recall, with antidepressants. That in itself was a very controversial category of medicines because there was concern about the extent to which these were being used, prescribed appropriately. Could they do more harm than good? Could they cause suicidal ideation um, during certain stretches of use, particularly when prescribed initially? And a lot of again, this is an area of Me Tooism, as I call it, where there's several different competing products. But one part of the marketing playbook involved ghostwriting, and that refers to the use of people other than academics or researchers from industry who were legitimately studying a product, a medicine, and preparing a medical journal article. The ghostwriting involved hiring individual writers but more often medical communications firms that would, if not fully write a journal article, more often what they would do was work in connection with one or more authors and essentially tailor craft the body of the article in a way that the language could skew subtly, perhaps, but nonetheless skew how the article, the content of the article is perceived in favor of the particular medicine. Um, this is very pervasive, actually. It popped up concerning GlaxoSmithKline and Paxil. And I remember I mentioned I live in Jersey. There's still a lot of pharmaceutical industry stuff around here. But I found just the other end of my own town, one of the companies that had been involved in that particular scandal. And I went knocking on their door and they wouldn't respond to my phone calls or my messages. I went at odd hours hoping to find someone to walking in or out. My timing was always bad. I never connected. But I mention that just because they were businesses all over, not just the geographic area where the companies were based, but really in different parts of the country because medical communications can be done anywhere. And this was a big part of the industry playbook. And it overall spoke to concerns that these financial ties would influence medical practice and medical research in a way that did not benefit the public, but benefited industry. And again, I keep using the word distortion because that isn't really shouldn't be the goal. So,
Mr. Silverman, I just want to hop in real quick. I do have
yeah,
a few questions in the
go ahead.
chat. So the first one is from Miss Martha Rosenberg, and she asked if you could discuss how and why large molecules edged out small.
So how and why large molecules what?
Why, how and why large molecules edged out smaller ones, the small molecules.
Um, okay. Well,
And
so
Ms. Rosenberg, if you wanted to hop on and just kind of
yeah,
clarify
could you just
question.
clarify that question a little bit for me so I address it properly? That'd be great.
Yeah, if you can hear me, all the biologics are called large molecule drugs, okay,
Mm-hmm.
which have completely usurped advertising on the TV. You know, that they began with Humira, and I'm just wondering what the financial benefits of those large molecule drugs are, since they're everywhere.
Oh, okay. So the the basic answer to that is that um, the biologics are they carry higher price tags and they're higher profit margins. So generally, so that is the key reason why they have become more popular, at least for treating certain types of illnesses. Um, does that answer your question? Or maybe there's something else you're thinking of?
Well, the idea of churning minor diseases to sell expensive biologics is kind of what I'm getting at. That the biologics and the injected drugs are so lucrative that, in my opinion, um, some minor diseases are now churned and sold to use. I'm thinking, and I'm not saying people don't have eczema or psoriasis or IBD, but just the idea that there's expensive treatments for them has become a new marketing push, I think.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, this started a number of years ago because that was that became a way of administering a medicine, and if it was more effective than a pill, on paper that makes sense. Um, but it's also more involved, so there was an opportunity more involved to develop or manufacture or both. That created the opportunity again on paper to charge more. So that explains why, you mentioned Humira. and all the competition that came after that. That's why they edged out the small molecules, the pills.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I answered your question, but um,
One more. This is very in the weeds, but how about um, GMO hamster ovaries and their role in these drugs?
well, you can play stump the farm a lot. I don't know enough about that to give you perhaps the answer you want. Um, Sorry, Martha. Uh,
Okay, thank you.
anyway,
All right. We do
Kelly,
have,
any other?
yeah, we do have a few others. I don't know if you wanted to keep going with the questions or if you wanted to save them for the end.
No, I'll go with a couple of questions now, then I'll come back because I feel like I've emphasized a lot of the history. I do want to make the point that before I take a couple of questions, this playbook that I spent time describing, it did eventually mitigate somewhat, in part I mentioned the Justice Department getting involved in whistleblower cases. Subsequently, a lot of the largest companies did reach settlements with the U.S. government, federal government, over what was called off-label marketing. That refers, of course, to prescribing a drug for unapproved use, not approved by the FDA. And the off-label marketing occurred often because physicians were enticed, encouraged to write prescriptions for drugs that perhaps weren't um, the best use of a medicine. Physicians are allowed to do that, but companies are not supposed to promote that activity. So this is an opportunity for the government to look at the kinds of marketing practices that were used by the pharmaceutical companies. Then the pharmaceutical industry came up with voluntary codes. Pharma, the big brand name trade group, I think came up with a code in 2011. The device trade group did so a few years later. Again, that's in this country. Some other countries started following suit. So the industry has been more sensitive, if you will, to this sort of behavior, but it doesn't mean it hasn't persisted to this day. But before I get to the here and now, sure, let's take a couple of questions.
All right, I have a question. The question is, do you think that the administration would be allowed to defund the FDA?
Allowed is the operative word there. Um, I think we're talking about, well, there's got to be an act of Congress in there somewhere because um, the FDA, the HHS, these were created not wholly out of cloth by a previous president. So, but as far as defunding, um, ostensibly, the HHS budgets could be cut. To what end? That's the real question there, right? Um, do we want to defund the FDA? It's sort of like the pendulum swinging, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. A few years ago, do we want to defund the police? Well, to the point where we don't have police? Is there a reason we had police in the first place? Can it be improved instead of decapitated? I guess the same thought process could be used to look at the FDA. If we want to defund the FDA, to what end? Um, but allowed by who? I think it's a very complicated question. It opens up a lot of different avenues of thought, but for me anyway. But um, I think the FDA does serve a purpose. I'm not sure most Americans would agree. It's hard to know. And even if we took a poll, it still doesn't mean something drastic couldn't change. But if there's a basic agreement that we need some form of public health um, agency to perform certain basic tasks, then I would like to think no, it won't happen, but never say never. Next question.
All right. So the next question is from Abrielle, who is also a HAPI student. And I think we touched on this a little bit in our conversation this morning, but her question is, what types of federal policies and regulations do you suggest to shift the current culture of the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, the open paint, well, in regards to the specific topic we're discussing, the open payments database was a worthwhile step in that direction because it did put on the table that there is interest in monitoring and tracking the kinds of financial influence that can exist between industry and physicians and academia. I think that was a big step in the right direction for those who care about that sort of thing, which I think is worth caring about myself. Um, but going forward, if we're talking, I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by the current culture. If you're talking about still this kind of behavior, um, it might be good to extend that requirement, the reporting requirement to that database to all sorts of people in healthcare. Everybody that, not everybody prescribes, but if you go to a hospital today, a crowded hospital today, you're going to run into the frontline soldiers. You're not going to immediately see a physician. You might see a nurse, you might see a physician's assistant. I know in nursing homes that have contracts with practices, they send out um, licensed nurses sometimes instead of physicians who will make recommendations when they talk to the physicians. So it it's worth considering extending that reporting requirement across the board because it would, even if those people are not really not getting the
Thank
kind of
you.
financial remuneration that doctors get, I think it would be worth putting it on the books anyway, if only because it doesn't hurt. But I'm not sure what else you mean by the current culture. Any other questions, or I'll keep going.
It looks like there's just one more question. So this is from Mr. Charles Bennett. He asked if have any MDs filed whistleblower suits?
Good question. I don't claim to have the most comprehensive memory. I know pharmacists have, but I don't want to say no, a physician hasn't. Um, for all I know, I've written about one in years past, and I just can't remember it right now. But certainly, they would have the same impetus and certainly the same perch to file such a lawsuit.
They just can't get in to the actual data. They don't have the access to the company's data.
I'm
The
sorry.
sales rep could say, "Look, I'm getting all this bad stuff."
I'm sorry, there's an echo. What were you saying?
The sales reps, they have access to bad stuff. Doctors don't.
It
Charlie,
depends
yes,
where a
they
physician
do.
works.
And
If a
there have been
physician,
whistleblower cases. There have
if,
been whistleblower cases filed by physicians.
okay, thank you. It depends where they work. If a physician works in a hospital, for instance, they might have a different perch. If you're working alone in your own practice, which is increasingly not what happens out there, but even if you're in a small practice, yes, you're correct. You're not going to see or be exposed to the kinds of um, contextual data. But if you're perhaps in a hospital, you certainly have a different situation where you might come across more data that would make that case. I just don't recall any off the top of my head. I'm sorry. Um,
And there is another question
okay.
from Mr. David Courtwright. It says, during the era you've described, 1995 to present, PBMs have become increasingly powerful and concentrated. What role, if any, did they play in introducing market distortions, particularly with respect to prescription opioids?
Well, it's that question speaks to the basic nature. I'm going to guess that Mr. Courtwright knows this already, but it speaks to the basic nature of the relationship between the PBMs and the pharmaceutical companies, because the PBMs have a lot of leverage when they determine how to craft their formularies, whether it's for a particular health plan customer or union or employer, or just across the board. If they're the very largest PBMs, they'll have sort of a national formulary, if you will. And so that leverage to determine where to place a medicine on a formulary is largely up to the PBM. So right there, you have the potential to distort that. And um, if you want to think about paybacks or payments, you could think of the word rebate, of course. Goes to the heart of the ongoing controversy over the opaque pricing in our country. And I think that, generally speaking, has applied to just about every category of medicine, not just opioids. I don't know that if the basic approach is different for opioids than others. It's a question of who gets the money. Okay.
If you want to continue, and we'll
Okay.
some more.
Sure. So I mentioned this playbook, and I think I placed it very much in historical terms, but there are also some recent examples that illustrate that the way the way that medicine is promoted is still problematic. There was in the UK, um, there is rather a trade group that functions more or less like pharma does in the United States. And as with pharma, it tried to come up with a voluntary code to monitor and to an extent police the kinds of interactions or communications from drug companies to the public, different sectors of the public, whether it's hospitals or physicians. They also have active patient groups. Often they're called trusts. Um, and um, a lot of the work of this particular voluntary oversight body kind of flies under the radar unless, you actively pay attention to it. I try to pay attention to it because every now and then there's an instance where a pharmaceutical company is speaking out of school. Twice in the past couple of years, 3 years, different CEOs of big drug companies, Pfizer, the Novo Nordisk, were admonished for speaking about a medicine in a way that suggested it could be used or should be used, even though it was not approved for particular use. This happened with the Pfizer CEO, for instance, concerning COVID products. Um, but in the past year, um, Novo Nordisk, which, as we know, sells a lot of insulin, diabetes products, and also for weight loss, of course, was slammed for not disclosing payments to health and patient groups. Um, and the company had already been uh, criticized pretty harshly by this trade group several times over the past few years for bringing discredit on the entire industry, having because it breached the voluntary codes as many times as it has. But this particular case, they failed to properly disclose these payments over a 7-year period. And last month, the PMCPA issued a very lengthy, in this case, it was a 79-page report that raised questions about the culture of the company. I mentioned this demonstrated poor governance as well. And I'm just going through this right now. Here, between 2015 and 2022, the report found Nova misreported 65 payments worth $969,000 to patient groups and healthcare uh, organizations in the UK. And the payments it reported did not match what was reported to a different industry database. Rather, the payments it reported on its own website did not match what was reported to Disclosure UK, which is an industry database. So there were discrepancies, and the company tried to essentially publicly understate what was really done. Why do I mention this? And I'm not going to go into further detail, but I mention this because, okay, well, 2022 was 3 years ago, but in the scheme of things, it's not that long ago. And because the PMCPA, the UK voluntary group, oversight group has continued to find more recent instances where the company has misbehaved, you have to wonder, well, did these marketing practices, generally speaking, really stop or really slow down? You know, Novo scientifically, you could say is an N of one, it's one company, but we care about this because it's increasingly a more and more important company, not just because of the insulin it's always sold, but now because of the products used for weight loss. And it has become sort of a poster boy litmus test for industry practice as a result. Um, so that's another recent example. And on a slightly different note, but related, um, I got I was made aware of a pretty interesting situation. It's not specifically about a drug company, but I talked to a couple of people at George Washington and some others about medical boards in the US. They were making use of a documentary about menopause for a continuing medical education credit. And which sounds great, but turns out the documentary contained a lot of misleading and inaccurate statements about menopausal therapies. And due to the pressure for some academics and advocates, and then I followed up with a story, um, the Federation of Boards decided to hit the pause button and remove the documentary from its website while it reviewed what to do. As far as I know, the board has not publicly, at least I followed up a few times, I, to ask, well, are you using or are you removing that documentary permanently and permanently removing it from the CME credit? I never got a straight answer. But I mention this because it's yet another example of how the promotion of medicines, this is a different route than the traditional route of approaching physicians directly through sales reps or some related form of marketing. But it's another example of how this sort of overall approach to promoting medicine can be distorted and how it can work its way into our system of education for physicians. And I suppose there are others out there, and if and when I come across them, I'll write about those too. Um, anyway, question time. More questions? Oh, there's a whole bunch here. Sorry.
So we have a question from Dr. Linda Martin. The question is, do you have thoughts about why no congressional hearing was held to investigate former FDA Commissioner Dr. Hamburg's illegal financial interests in the $3 billion of drug stocks, and why no reporter has covered this massive fraud against the US government?
Okay. Before I get to that, I see. Yeah, somebody mentioned when it comes to physicians filing whistleblower lawsuits, someone mentioned Jesse Polanski. And yeah, there's an example where I forgot. I wrote about Polanski's suit concerning Pfizer and Lipitor several times, but it was so long ago. Forgive me, I forgot. But thanks for the reminder. Back to the question. I don't know why there was no congressional hearing concerning any ties between Hamburg and uh, anyone in her family and financial interests with drug companies. I do recall reading one or two stories about this, but it was a long time ago. Um, I don't know why. Um, I don't know why Congress didn't make more of it. Maybe because there was not enough attention on it. I don't know. Or maybe it was determined that there wasn't enough there. I don't have a good answer for you.
All right. Next question is from, I don't know if it's Andre or Andrea Thompson. It says, can you verify that Purdue Pharma adjusted the X and Y axis on their graph demonstrating smaller peaks and valleys for OxyContin versus other opioids? If so, do you know of any other drugs the FDA has approved based on blatantly skewed data?
I can't verify that because I can't remember in such detail over, however much time has elapsed, what those graphs look like. So I'm sorry, Andrea. I can't give you a good answer. Um, I just don't have an encyclopedic recall for that sort of thing right now. Um, and I don't know for the same reason I don't know the answer to your second question. Um, I my gut tells me um, that it happened the way you're asking, but I don't want to say the wrong thing. I'm sorry.
Okay, and then let me see.
Well, that's an interesting picture in the Montreal airport. Um, did you report it to the Montreal, whatever Montreal authority? Is trying to save the picture to my computer.
And there is another question.
Sorry for the interruption. That's very interesting. Um, I don't know why that would appear as it does in the Montreal airport. That's very good. That's a very good catch. Even if it doesn't mention what it's used for, it's pretty clear if we know what the name of the product is, right? Um, and yes, Joel Lexton is correct. Not only was Novo Nordisk slammed by the UK oversight agency that's part of the industry trade group, they were suspended for 2 years. That's why I should have remembered that, but that's why I said that Novo is a very recent example of why we need to remain interested and vigilant concerning any inappropriate marketing practices. There's pretty much there in the UK, they're a bit of a poster boy, as I said.
Did you
Okay.
want to do another question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Sorry.
So this is from Ms. Kim Witzak. She said, curious what you think about separating post-market safety from approvals at FDA. Back in 2007, there was a bipartisan effort by Grassley and Dodd to create a separate center. It didn't pass them, but seems like they're swinging towards interest in harms in the FDA process.
Um, so when you say separating post-marketing safety from approvals, Kim, you mean
Oh,
emphasizing?
hi.
Hi,
It's
Kim.
good to see you. Hi. Yeah, because at one point, like right now, the approval, I mean, the same people that approve the drugs are the ones that are responsible for monitoring post-market. And back in 2007, we worked on an initiative with Grassley and Dodd to create a separate center. So it'd be completely separate staffers, completely focus, not the same people, etc. And of course, it died. And part of the thing was pharma came out and said, "Oh well, we don't have the money to create a separate, literally a separate center, meaning a separate building, but it was really separate departments."
Right.
And so that it isn't the same, people, because obviously human, even if you didn't see it, like who wants to admit they made a mistake?
Right. Okay, I see. Thank you for clarifying. Basically, I think it's a good idea. I don't think there's been enough emphasis. I mean, there has been data released by FDA at different times about post-marketing um, commitments and what's been done, what hasn't been done. Um, but I think the fact that you have to do that in the first place suggests that, well, if we keep finding, if there's a continuing reason to track who's doing or not doing what they should be doing, maybe we need to take a different approach to ensure they're doing what they should be doing. So, in a perfect world, it would be great to have the resources to do it. Whether we can get the resources is another question, but I do think it's worth pursuing because there isn't really still, I don't think, enough emphasis on this problem. And I also think that even when the FDA makes a post-marketing requirement, it isn't as if there is one template. Admittedly, each medication, each disease is different, but we don't want to give companies so much leeway that we don't get a post-marketing commitment that takes 6 years, for instance, after approval. I think if we're concerned about safety, we should be stricter. Basically, the agency should be stricter about saying um, a maximum of this, or however you want to phrase it, however you want to think about it, not just legally, but practically. But I think that's also been a bit of a problem. And I think that, uh, it unfortunately remains an issue. Okay, there's some more
Thanks.
questions.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing back history because I think in this current era, we've kind of forgot and we've walked away from all of these past drug safety issues that have been existing. So I appreciate you bringing up all of this. Good.
Oh, okay. Joel just answered my question. Thank you, Joel. For those who can't see this or I don't know if you can see the chat. Joel Lexton writes, in Canada, companies can't mention the name of the drug and its indication in the same ad. They can name the drug and use images that suggest the use, but uh, sorry. Uh,
Everyone can see the chat, Ed.
okay. So I'm technologically behind the times. I didn't realize. So anyway, the answer is in there. Um, sorry. Okay.
I just wanted to hop in here, Mr. Silverman. Are there any happy student questions? I see we're kind of getting close to time, and I wanted to make sure if any of my peers had any questions, they could hop in.
On behalf of the students, Ed, I do want to ask you, what's the role of an investigative journalist? What's been your role in all of this over the years? What can the students learn from your career choice? Would you advise any of them to enter the journalism field?
That's a loaded question these days. First of all, I want to thank Joel Lexton for clarifying the point about the ads in Canada. Thank you, Joel. Well, there are a couple of different ways of thinking about the answer. One is the political environment. The other is the business environment. The one thing I did, and I think it can still apply, but for those who don't know or don't remember, I'd said that I started covering this business 30 years ago. About 10 years ago, I'd been in the same spot all that time, got a little bored. Coincidentally, the owners of the large media company that owned the paper where I was working wanted website ideas. I read a book about citizen journalism called We the People. Essentially, it was the forerunner to blogging. And that's when I came up with an idea for something about pharma and ended up becoming called Pharmalot and launched as a blog in '07. I took it with me to different media companies and I took it to Stat 10 years ago. But I mention this because it was a vehicle for me to extend my career because at the time, newspaper advertising was going down. This is the business answer, by the way. Advertising was going down, newspapers were pressured, and living online seemed to be a way to extend my career without saying, well, I had a good run, time to do something else, because I liked what I was doing. I ended up owning Pharmalot, so it became a business proposition, not just a career move. And why do I mention this? Because it was all about branding myself. I wasn't really doing anything different different in terms of skills or abilities or activities, but I allowed myself to become identified with a particular brand instead of saying, oh, I'm with the Star Ledger of New Jersey, or oh, I'm with the Wall Street Journal, which is where I worked for a while as well. I brought my blog there. Yes, I would stay. What I would say is I run the Pharmalot blog for so and so. For a while, I ran it independently, but I kept the brand identity. And why might that be helpful to people who are considering something in this field? Let's face it, most people don't get wealthy going into journalism. There was a time when you could pretty much hope that you could have a middle class existence, but things change in this world. And so one way of looking at a future might be to brand yourself, focus on something specific, and come up with a way to be identified, i.e., a brand name, and use that as often as possible. It helps to get your expertise somewhere else first, which is what I did. If you have it out of the gate, great. Um, be prepared to have a lot of challenges in terms of figuring out how to support yourself, because you can't just assume they'll have advertisers or subscribers. You might need to sponsor conferences, events, they call them, all of the above. Um, Speaking perhaps, but no, I didn't get paid for this. But sometimes some people do. But my point is that you need to think about the business opportunity, not just a career. How can you make yourself the object of desire, if you will, the source of content, the source of information? Um, Now, the political question, I could be smarmy and say, if you really want to be an enemy of the people, this is a good time. But in all seriousness, I think it's more important than ever because I'm idealistic. But one thing that prompted me to get into this line of work, because I was an accounting major, was I used to go home from school and watch the Watergate hearings during lunch. I lived that close, I could do that, and then go back to school. And so, and this is before the movie All the President's Men came out, but that era affected me, and there was a public service mission involved. So that shaped my thinking, and I think we're in an era of that sort again. So if you can figure out the career path and maybe a business model, and combine that, if you will, or at least keep those parallel thoughts in mind, yeah, there's more demand than ever, assuming media companies don't capitulate uh, in this environment. Sorry, I got on my soapbox for a while, didn't I?
Um,
Any other questions?
yeah, so CJ just sent over a question. He said, what are some of the biggest challenges you face in uncovering and reporting the truth, especially when reporting on powerful industry players with a lot of public influence?
What are the biggest challenges? Um, Getting people to trust you. The reality, of course, is that people in large companies are scared. And it's not just this era. It's just human nature. If you're working for a large organization, you're dependent upon them for your livelihood. You're going to be scared to talk out of school. I've sort of used, you have to start somewhere. So if you do a story that pushes back against conventional wisdom, the party line, all these cliches about what an industry or a business or a government wants you to think or know about. If you push back against that and run a story that presents an not an alternative reality, but an alternative way of looking at things, or maybe the reality as it's not portrayed publicly, then that one story is seen by others, and you can develop a reputation where people might trust you. Trust is hard to develop and maintain because you have to find ways to convince those folks to talk to you and provide documents or stories or other people to talk to that help you understand and then corroborate whatever it is you think you need, whatever story you think you need to report and get out there. Um, Different people have different ideas of how to deal with reporters, what's off the record, what's not. But I think developing trust is the biggest challenge, and it's difficult to do that because people are putting their faith in you that you will tell the story as they see it. And sometimes people have their own agenda, and it's not necessarily everything you'd want to know when you're reporting a story. Sometimes people hold back, even if they're the whistleblower or the aggrieved employee. But it takes a lot of finesse and a lot of time. So you have to be willing to think, what aren't they telling me? Why might they not be telling me something else? Or what don't they know? What might they not know that I should think about learning before I go ahead and assume I know everything I need to? This isn't the situation where you get up one morning and something happens and you have 2 hours to write 500 words. I'm talking about something obviously more complicated and more nuanced. I hope that helps. It's kind of vague, but it really is what I run into a lot.
All right. We have another question from Ms. Lisa Vertinsky. And the question is, can you speculate on why there is such a concerted effort to impede NIH activities? It seems to me that there is particular focus on HHS.
Right now, I think it stems from the controversy over COVID and the extent to which the NIH, HHS could be trusted once the COVID pandemic hit and how to deal with that, the origins of the virus, how to mitigate the virus, which treatments were or weren't effective, how fast we should pursue vaccines. Did industry come through? Were they overpaid? All these questions, they're not new questions. These have been kicked around on social media endlessly for the last few years. And I think a lot of it has to do with the perception of the federal agency that was responsible for the answers or the activities that I just mentioned. And the new administration that is coming in, one may have an ideological way of looking at that agency and its role. Um, and it's also a juicy target for anybody who simply says, well, there's X billions of dollars involved with its budget. We could slash some of that. So it fits that paradigm as well.
All right. Are there any additional questions? Feel free to use the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask verbally.
So I could use a second to just put in a plug here, which is that in a seminar series, and many of you are regular participants, but some of you aren't. We've had some great speakers over the last few years, and a number of them appear in recordings that we've been able to make and with the presenters' permission have up through our website. So at hapi.georgetown, hapi.georgetown.edu, you can access a number of our past seminar recordings, and some of them relate to some of the questions that have been brought up. In particular, the talk by Paul Offit, I think it was last week or week before, he talked a lot about some of the issues with COVID and what some of the controversial points have been. And I don't know if that one is up yet. It will be, and I would encourage people to look at that if you haven't seen it already.
Going back to the person who asked me about challenges and trust, this was pertinent, a pertinent experience. I forget how I came into contact with this person. It was only by phone and email. I never met him, but he had been a Pfizer sales rep. This was back in 2007. And I talked to him over a number of weeks, and he finally agreed to provide me with internal marketing documents, including specific sets of documents that were used to train sales reps. And the company was deliberately not only ignoring prohibition against off-label prescribing, but actively encouraging reps to go ahead and talk to doctors about off-label prescribing. And what was remarkable to me was, one, the kind of language used in these internal documents. And it wasn't just one page in one document, it permeated the various documents that I received over time. Um, but it was sort of a blatant disregard for the law. And unfortunately, I can't display that on the screen. But this fellow came to me because he was so outraged and concerned for himself. He was afraid that if it ever was investigated by the government, he might get in trouble. And that's, I should have mentioned earlier, that's often had been a motivator for the salespeople I talked to who filed whistleblower suits. Some of them wanted the money. I think all of them wanted the money at some point, but many of them were also scared because they realized they played a role in this. And this particular episode was very eye-opening because this was by revenue the largest drug company in the world, certainly with enough money to ensure that its compliance department was well staffed and functioning properly as well as much as its marketing staff. But that also took a lot of time because this person was so scared. I subsequently learned he wasn't based that far from me physically, geographically, but did not want to be seen anywhere near me, no matter what. And we found a way to send me information that um, I could subsequently use, including the documents I mentioned. It was kind of a fun episode, sort of like dealing with WikiLeaks and the whole encrypted business. That if you ever dealt with WikiLeaks, that it's quite an exercise. But the trust was that I had to develop the trust with him, and so that the information could not be traced back to that guy. So.
All right. We've just got two more questions. Ms. Martha Rosenberg asked, do you see DTC advertising ever going away?
Direct to consumer advertising. Well, I guess that's come up again, right? With the new administration. So, well, in general, I wouldn't say nothing ever could change. There's good reason to have a debate after all these years about DTC advertising. There's a reason that it's only permitted as we know of it in two countries, the United States and I think New Zealand is the other. Um, and that's, yes, our health system is different, but um, I do think there's a downside to certain types of direct to consumer advertising if the information is not properly conveyed. And by that, I mean the risk information. Um, so, given the new administration and the new head of the HHS, yeah, I could see that being reviewed. Will we get rid of it? I don't know. You also have an industry that's very popular, and you have someone in the White House who's very transactional, and the give and take can yield, I don't know, who knows what. But I could see it being put on the table, if only as a bargaining chip.
All right, Mr. Charles Bennett asked, have you ever heard of the theory of fraud on the FDA, which is at the Third Circuit in appeals? And is that
Um, yeah, I'm not sure I know which case you're talking about. I'm sorry, I try to track a lot of them, and maybe I've written about this or maybe I haven't, but yes, I'm familiar with it. Why do you ask?
Is if I can get through, Elizabeth, if you're on the phone, maybe you could address Linda. I might can't get any of my team. I just want to know if it's something relevant.
Charlie, do you want me to mention fraud on the FDA?
It is, yes.
Okay. The idea is that if a pharmaceutical company omits relevant information in their application for a drug's approval and or distorts the situation in any way, and the drug is subsequently approved and people use it and are harmed, can someone, a whistleblower, sue the FDA or the drug company, I'm sorry, the drug companies for their past behavior, even if that past behavior, that misleading the FDA, occurred many years previously. And the Department of Justice filed an amicus brief in this particular case that Charles Bennett is involved in, with a lot of interesting material. I don't know, maybe you could send that to anybody who is interested?
Yeah,
Dr.
I'm not sure
Bennett?
which case you're referring to, but I don't recall
It's
this off the top of my head.
it's just happening now. The court is considering it. The appeals court is considering it. So it's you know it's you shouldn't be embarrassed that you haven't heard about it yet. It hasn't done anything remarkable yet. But if the court rules that the pharmaceutical companies that did this, Bayer and Johnson, are to blame, this would be then big news.
Yeah, it's fraudulent inducement, right? So yeah, I've referred to that as when it's come up in past litigation cases. I'm just not, I guess I'm not familiar with this one particular filing.
Can you tell us about the past cases it's come up in?
Well, again,
And we don't mean to quiz you. We're not trying to put you on the spot.
no,
But
it's okay.
Dr. Bennett
No,
is really interested in this right now.
no,
As you can
my editor
understand.
does this all the time because I've been covering this like 20 years longer than him. So he always tries to stump me thinking I'm holding back. And I'm not here either. I just can't remember. I know it's come up before, I'm sorry. But not recently, I guess, and something I've written about, which is why I can't remember.
So I hate to break it up here, but we do have that 1:15 cutoff.
Oh,
So I do just want
Thank
to
you.
yeah, just finish it off. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Mr. Silverman, for coming and speaking with us, and thank you to all of the listeners for asking all of those inquisitive questions. And we look forward to seeing you all next week.
well, thank you for
And
having me. Thanks for all the really interesting questions and comments. I'm sorry I didn't have the best answers for some of you, but it was really interesting. You posed a lot of interesting issues and questions for me, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate your interest in what I'm doing, and look forward to keeping in touch with all of you if you are willing to do so. Thank you.
thanks so much on behalf of the program, Ed and Michaela. Great job today moderating. We look forward to seeing everyone again next week at noon Eastern time. The week after that is actually spring break at Georgetown, so we're going to miss a week, but we will be here next week, and then after that 1 week, we'll be here for the rest of the semester. So we'll see you again. Thanks for coming and participating. Great talk, Ed.
Thank you for having me.
Bye
Bye,
all.
everybody.